Well, hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what's making the headlines with the Chief Executive of Total Politics Group, Mark Wallace, and the new Statesman's policy and politics correspondent, Zoe Grunewald, who are with us from now until midnight. Welcome to both of you. So as ever, to the front pages we start. The Metro has news of NHS waiting lists hitting a record high of 7.7 million. Same story for the Eye. They say the PM has blamed doctor strikes for the government missing their key pledge to cut waiting lists. Starmer criticised by left and right, according to The Guardian, following Labour's announcement on their plans to tackle the small boats crisis. The Daily Telegraph reports that unvaccinated children face being forced to isolate for 21 days as measles cases continue to rise. The final betrayal reads The Mirror. They say HS2 has been hit with fresh turmoil after the government refused to rule out axing the Manchester leg of the project. The Financial Times carries good news for the chip maker ARM, whose initial public offering, IPO, has performed well on America's Nasdaq exchange. And the Daily Star reports that a rogue Russian pilot fired 2 missiles at an RAF jet. Well, quick reminder, by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of the papers while you watch us. So let's head straight to our guests then, Zoe and Mark. Welcome to both of you. Let's start with NHS waiting list, shall we, Zoe? 7.7 million people, the Metro tells us, 7.7 million people who may well have had their elective surgery cancelled, their appointments rescheduled, may well be living in pain. It's not a good number.
No, it's not a good number. It's terrible for the public and it's terrible for the Prime Minister and the government. So 1 in 7 people are waiting to start treatment. It only seems to be going up and up. If we remember the start of the year, Sunak said one of his pledges was to cut NHS waiting lists. Unfortunately, like the rest of his pledges, it doesn't seem to be going to plan. What's really difficult about this politically for Sunak is that when you have 1 in 7 people in your population with a chronic health condition waiting for treatment, in pain, and then everybody else who's related to them who can see them suffering, you don't look too kindly on the NHS, you don't look too kindly on the government, and then people start to wonder whether the government is making things better for them, and after 13 years, if they still want to keep this government in, if it's only going to let public services degrade, get worse. So this is really politically difficult for Sunak, added to the list of pledges that aren't going too well, and he's going to have to answer to the British public about why this is and why he hasn't got a grip on it.
Well, some explanations today. For example, strike action. The political argument is in the Eye. Sunak says it's doctors' fault. A suggestion is that there's no way you can get waiting lists down when your medics are off work.
Indeed, as you would imagine, this has been poo-pooed by various of the campaign organisations.
BMA, for example.
And of course, the BMA, the Doctors' Trade Union. But at minimum, it hasn't helped, has it? I mean, the fact is there were, 700,000 cancelled appointments or procedures estimated as a result of the strikes so far. There are more strikes coming down the line. That isn't going to help. Part of the issue here, just as Zoe says, the fact is that obviously these are not just statistics, they're not just political footballs back and forth. These are millions of people who are desperately waiting for their treatment. And yes, a downside of government is you get blamed for everything in every part of the state of the nation. The upside of government is you get to choose your own targets. You set out your own message and then you have the power to implement them or not. And the problem that the Prime Minister now has is that he chose these targets at the start of the year. He presumably chose them on the basis that they were appealing, but he thought they could be hit. Something like this is always going to be important, but it's particularly important because Downing Street chose to make it one of the tests on which they said they should be judged.
Well, I think the BMA acknowledged that, this has an impact. The strike days has had an impact, but it's the tip of the iceberg compared to the direction of travel, accusing them of the years of austerity, obviously, and indeed the COVID crisis, where people's operations did get cancelled as hospitals filled up with people who had COVID. The question is now how you end the strikes, I suppose. What is on offer and what now is being demanded and how you close the gap, because nobody's talking to each other.
So the BMA were asking for quite a considerable pay rise in the 30%, and there was no movement on that. And they're very, very strident about the fact that doctors haven't had a considerable considerable pay rise for years. We saw nurses come to a pay agreement of, I think it was 6%, if I remember correctly, and doctors are nowhere near that. So the government doesn't have very much room to budge, but also the doctors hold quite a lot of power here. You know, NHS waiting lists are going up. People are very distressed about that, and the BMA aren't moving, and doctors are, I think, reasonably angry about the fact that they haven't seen any reasonable pay rise with inflation over the last few years. As you say, ministers need to get around the table and talk, but eventually, you know, as with the cost of living, there's going to have to be some sort of agreement, and it's which side will budge first. And
part of the issue here is that if we simultaneously have the situation that the NHS has more money spent on it than ever before, that it is growing, it continues to grow in its cost, it is generally felt not to have sufficient money, then the idea of a pay settlement and anything like that, where on earth does that come from? Where does it come from? We look around the economy, we look at the cost of living crisis, inflation, economic red flags in various different directions. There's nowhere where that's going to be magically squeezed from.
And the cost of borrowing for government now as well.
The cost of borrowing for government
borrowing is going up for them.
Which has its own knock-on effect, exactly. So I do, you know, I agree the BMA have a lot of power in this situation, but they also have the difficulty that if they have an unfulfillable demand and they're an irresistible force, well, what happens? And patients end up stuck in the middle.
Well, it's not just about pay the visit, it is about working conditions. And if you've got the massive backlog after COVID and COVID was bad enough, you know your working conditions are going to be bad, and you've got a retention and recruitment crisis on top. You know, there are incentives for government to pay more and offer more at this point, don't you think, Mark?
Well, the message is clearly that, well, if the message is that you pay something at 20-30% more, then this might be resolved. I think the problem is that just isn't going to happen. And the issue is that this does need, you know, I don't think there's a hugely, you know, cynical agenda on behalf of most doctors about this. There have been some somewhat unsavoury comments from some parts of the BMA, I think, in recent months that have come to light, some officials there. But the fact is, if you need a real solution, patients want a real solution, yeah. It's not going to come just by saying, yeah, totally fine, tick the box, move on. And obviously, one of his other pledges is bring inflation down, so they're not going to hand out billions and billions and billions in pay.
Yeah, and another is stop the boats. But let's talk about Sir Keir Starmer's plans for that, shall we? On front page of The Guardian, which I thought might be more supportive, but says that Starmer's plan has been criticised by both left and right over his plan. So which bits are being picked apart by which side?
So it seemed pretty on brand for Starmer now that he's always being picked apart by the left and the right. He's very much leaning into the sort of centrism of the Labour Party. You've seen a lot of interventions from former Labour Prime Ministers, for example, who have been advising Starmer. And I think the thing that Starmer's trying to pull out here is that he's trying to present an immigration policy that will appeal to Conservative voters as well as Labour voters. Now, the problem with that is, of course, those voters won't always agree on the best approach when it comes to immigration. So what he's tried to do is fudge something a little bit, I think. So the left are angry, or the left of the Labour Party are angry with Starmer for saying that those who disagreed with his proposals were un-British, that they would treat criminals involved in cross-channel people smuggling as terrorists and other parts of his plan, whereas the right are seemingly annoyed that he wants to do a deal with the EU about sending back migrants, because they say that will mean that we have to take some as well, and we're basically reopening relationships with the EU that they think have put to bed. So it's not really a surprise that Starmer is kind of irritating everybody. I think he would say that's a sort of necessary evil to get the job done, because unfortunately immigration is a really sticky political situation. Clearly something has to be done, but we also have to be realistic about it. The migration crisis is only going to get worse. Countries will have to cooperate. You know, we are an island, but we cannot do it alone. And I think there are quite a lot of sensible proposals in there. One of the things I do think that Starmer should have pulled out is safe and legal routes, because currently there aren't safe and legal routes for a lot of people crossing the Channel, and arguably that would stop the boats if people could cross in a safe and legal way. But that's not very politically appetising, because it sounds like you want to bring more migrants in, which is a very delicate position.
Yeah, much easier to say, let's treat people smugglers as terrorists. So two issues for Starmer. One, about both on cooperation with Europe. One on intelligence, not surprising he was at Europol today. Secondly, about returns, you know, getting more returns. The problem is we only have returns agreements with 6 nations now after Brexit. So how do you return them without offering something back, which is now the accusation that you're going to get 100,000 asylum seekers sent by Europe and therefore you've got a charter to drop asylum seekers in this country.
100,000 or more, depending on the allocation. And in that particular potential agreement, that isn't a return to what was there before. That was something that we weren't in as part of the EU. The idea of the common asylum policy on an EU level was not something that the UK was part of when it was an EU
Which is
member.
just Schengen, isn't it?
Well, precisely, operates in it's related to that, kind of mapped across, as it were. I think there's a really serious question about whether actually, safe and legal routes to cross the Channel or a sharing of asylum seekers who are within the EU ought to be the UK's policy goal when we're talking about people who are in danger from tyranny, from aggression, from war around the world. Is it actually the case that where we should be looking to be compassionate is specifically with people who are currently in, say, France or Czechia or Italy? Or is it the case that if you look back to what, say, the coalition or the Cameron government did on a not big enough scale, but around Syria, which was to say, we're going to go to the region, we're going to go to the camps in the region, find the people in the most need and bring them directly here, rather than have this filtration thing where if you do have just about enough money to be able to get to Europe or to be able to get to a people smuggling gang, actually that is the...
But that's still just chicken feed. It's a tiny bit of policy, isn't it? Bringing 20,000 or whatever as we promised at the time.
And I just said it wasn't enough. I would wish it'd be more.
Well, he also wanted to pay money, so you stayed in locality and you paid neighbouring countries.
But remember, this was Merkel's humanitarian disaster in part, because she said if you can get here, if you can get to Germany, then you're welcome to stay, which helped to create and fuel that market for people smuggling gangs. This question is the real question of who we should prioritise when I'd hope we would all agree that Britain should be a help and a safe haven for people in the world who are in danger. I do not believe there are people in France today who are in danger directly of dictatorship, because France is not a dictatorship. There are people, however, fleeing Syria,
that argument doesn't
fleeing
matter,
Ukraine,
though, does it? Because they're still trying to come to this country illegally, and we cannot get them back to France. So, so it doesn't matter why. It doesn't matter that they don't want to stay there for any reason.
I mean, the other part of this, of course, is that there's a major issue kicking off about this question of the common policy and sharing allocations within the European Union itself. And we're seeing countries, including Poland, among others, kicking off in a big way about this. That's going to get worse. I don't think particularly joining a policy which is actually already going to be a subject of dispute among EU members is going to be the right way to go.
Yeah, and just quickly, the Daily Telegraph also has it on the front. Braverman attacks Starmer over migrants. Well, we would expect her to, wouldn't we? Suella Braverman saying Sir Keir Starmer would make Britain the dumping ground for EU migrants, which we've already said about this idea of burden sharing, which, to be fair, Sir Keir Starmer said was embarrassing nonsense, didn't he, today?
It would be more shocking if she didn't attack Keir Starmer about this. It is literally her job.
But the end result is what? That anybody has a solution to this or not, Zoe, do you think?
Well, I think obviously Labour are going to put forward a cohesive plan at some point for immigration, and to be honest, we're going to see a lot of wrangling between the two parties over this issue as we come up to the election, because it's so politically contentious and they can get each other into all sorts of holes over it. But ultimately, I don't think either party at the minute is having a really sensible, honest conversation with the British public about the sort of crisis we are going to expect to do with migration and how we're going to deal with that. And quite frankly, neither of them want to talk about it, because there's no way we can do it without international cooperation, of which we seem to have dug ourselves into a hole in over the last 6 years and gone to be an island again. So both parties are sparring and they're sort of arguing over details, but I don't think either of them are currently offering something that really is realistic and sustainable in the long term.